Splatoon is one of the biggest success stories of Nintendo's recent history. I mean, you launch a new IP 3 years into the life of the Wii U, which is your biggest failure in terms of like major home consoles, and it still gets enough traction that on the next platform you have two sequels on the same console, and they're all hugely popular. Each game in the Splatoon series has become, is one of the most popular games on that platform, and it's one of the most recognizable franchises that Nintendo has right now, and that's really impressive to do that during one of the worst generations in your company's history. That's something. There's something special here. But it's also very apparent that the Splatoon series of games is very, very focused on multiplayer. And that's also part of why it's so successful. I think it's actually the biggest factor is that it was a fresh new multiplayer game that still feels very much like Nintendo, but it came at a time where it really felt, a lot of people felt that Nintendo really needed something like that because there was a lot of Marios and Zeldas and Pokemon, so a lot of repetitive stuff, especially during this Wii U era where everything felt very safe. So they did this brand new thing and it worked out really well. But they are very heavy multiplayer focused games, which, if you know me, I'm not a very big multiplayer guy at all. So why do I have all three of these games? Oops. Well, I was very curious about. I know these games had a single player component to them, and I was very curious about whether they would be worth it for that. So I did buy all of these used, so my perspective is a little skewed because I paid a lot less for them than you would if you bought each of these games new. But I kind of wanted to answer that question that I had been wondering about, which is, are these games worth it if you only care about the single player component of them? So I wanted to break down the entire series and what they do to be worth your time. So starting with Splatoon 1, this was very clearly a very multiplayer focused game, as I've already mentioned, and that's kind of true for the entire series, but I feel like that was especially true at this point. The multiplayer was a big focus, and there is a campaign though. It doesn't feel as fleshed out as games would be later in the series. So the way that the campaign in Splatoon works is that you have about 5 worlds, and unlike the main multiplayer modes where your goal is to cover the floor with the most ink, these are more so platforming and shooting levels combined. So you have to move through these levels, you have to defeat enemies, you use your ink to make traversal easier, but at the end of the day your objective is to defeat enemies and free the Zapfish at the end of each stage. And then there's boss fights at the end of each of the 5 worlds. Now, the gameplay is very fun. I think every Splatoon game has that going for it, is that it's pretty fun to play. Aiming feels mostly natural. You can use the analog stick, but there's a big gyro component to it. And I think motion is still one of the best ways to aim in shooter games, so it feels pretty good to play. But it's not a very challenging game, and it's not like a hugely expensive adventure with super unique ideas beyond that movement, the idea of movement in the ink that you probably already have seen in trailers and everything. It's not some crazy adventure. However, during that adventure, you do, if you want, and find these hidden, the sunken scrolls in each of the levels. And these can sometimes give you a little bit of more about the world, but it doesn't feel super substantial most of the time. I feel like unless you're really dedicated to this kind of thing and looking into it more deeply, you wouldn't really get a lot of story just from the sunken scrolls as they are presented to you in the game. But there's enough to be fun. However, if you're buying this game brand new for $50 or $60 when it came out, I don't think it would be worth it for the single player campaign, and this is definitely the weakest of the 3 games in terms of the single player component. But it is a nice introduction, and if you're someone who's invested in this kind of stuff, the game is mentioned in later entries in some ways, so I think it's interesting to have that context, but by itself and at full price, I think Splatoon 1 really didn't do enough to be worth, that asking price if you only care about the single player component. But then we have Splatoon 2, which only came out 2 years later. And I think because of that, there wasn't really a lot of time to make this a more impressive experience than the first one was. Nintendo was coming off of this very unsuccessful generation they had with the Wii U, and they wanted the Switch to have, as much as possible. They kind of wanted to reuse a lot of the effort that they put into the Wii U onto Switch games. And so Splatoon 2 feels very heavily based on that first title. And the campaign is very similar too. So it's still about 5 worlds, and it actually repeats a lot of the same beats, like even the final boss of the game is the same. Well, it's the same character. Obviously, the combat itself is different, but it is the same character, and it doesn't really feel like the stakes increase at all in this second outing. And everything is just very similar. The main change in the second game is that instead of just upgrading your basic gear, in the first game, your upgrades were, you had your main weapon, you would upgrade that, and then you had the bombs, you could unlock bombs and upgrade the bombs and things like that. That was the first game. And in the second game, they changed it a little bit so that you actually unlock a lot of weapons during the campaign. So you don't have just like the hero shot. There are a lot of weapons, based on the roller, the brawler weapons and all of that. You unlock and upgrade all of those. And this kind of extends the longevity of the game in the sense that it does keep track of how you beat each stage with every weapon in your arsenal. So it can extend the length of the game if you're someone who's a completionist, but I feel like it does it in a way that's a little too artificial and too repetitive, because you have to play each stage like 6 times to beat it with each of the main weapons that you can unlock. So I don't think it is entirely worth it to do that. I didn't do that. I beat a bunch of the stages with multiple weapons, but not all of them. And it would get a little too repetitive. And again, the story doesn't really increase the stakes very significantly. There are new bosses, there are some new movement options in the game, but I don't feel like it evolved the campaign in a very significant way to be really worth doing this again, at full price especially. I don't think it is worth it for like the story. The gameplay itself is still fun, but it doesn't do a whole lot to be different and more engaging. But then something really special happened, because 1 year later, give or take, Nintendo announced something called the Octo Expansion DLC for Splatoon 2. And right now, and since Nintendo launched the Switch Online expansion pack tier, that DLC is included in that subscription at no additional cost, so, it doesn't have as much of an impact if you have that subscription. But either way, the Octo Expansion DLC changed everything about, the single-player component of these games, and Splatoon 2 specifically, of course. So in the Octo Expansion DLC, which is a completely new campaign, it's got almost no connection to the base game. You play as a new character, which is actually an Octoling, so it's of the Inklings that you play as in the main campaign, and it's worth noting that, in the main campaigns you're fighting against the Octarians, which is a race that's more inspired by, the octopus as a species. You play against those species, and you have the Octolings as the highest form of enemy in those campaigns usually. In the Octo Expansion DLC, you play as one of these characters. It doesn't really change the gameplay, that much in terms of how the character plays. It still feels very much the same as playing with an Inkling, just with a different design. But it is, from a story perspective, it's interesting that you're now playing as someone who used to be the bad guy, and your support system, your helpers, are actually the same people that supported your main character in the previous main campaign. So you have this Octoling that's actually friendly towards the Inklings that you play in the main campaigns. So that's kind of interesting. The setup in the Octo Expansion DLC is a little bit different though. So there's no hub world, there's no no hub where you travel from level to level. So instead, what you have is this map that is the subway map, and you just select the station you want to go to from the menu, and you can kind of just go wherever you want from there. Like each level will usually unlock when you beat it every adjacent station, so you can go whatever way you want from there and just beat every level if you want. There are certain levels that are, the main focus, and your goal is to collect enough of these specific items that will allow you to get to the final boss of that campaign. But, this different setup, it's a little more simplistic, but it does make things feel a little bit fresh because it's much more snappy to get into levels. And then the levels themselves feel a lot more snappy and focused, so they're a little bit faster. They're a lot harder though, so they're a lot more challenging than the base campaigns in either Splatoon 1 or 2. There's a lot more challenge, but they're a little bit more snappy. They feel a little more, they get to the point a bit more quickly, in my opinion. And so the campaign, the entire time, feels a lot more fresh than the first two campaigns, the main campaigns in Splatoon 1 and 2 did. And it's really fun. Like, it was very hard. And I mean, not overall, I guess saying it's very hard is a little unfair. It is definitely beatable, but it is a lot more fresh, and that's what's important here. Like, it feels way more interesting than the previous iterations, and I really like that about it. It really was needed at this point after I played those first two games, very close to each other, and so having this new campaign that is completely different in the way that it's structured, it felt really fresh. The levels are way more compelling to play. There are a lot of new concepts that are introduced, like, you have to push like a sort of bowling ball throughout a level in some cases, and that's the main goal. And the concepts themselves are just a little bit different, and there's a lot of the different ideas in terms of the war as well, because you're a Noctoling, but you're not fighting against Inklings now. You're fighting against these sort of distorted versions of Octolings that are out to get you for some reason. And it sounds very, very interesting to kind of put this new spin on the story. So it makes this part of the campaign way more engaging and way more fun. And then the way that you actually progress through the campaign is interesting, because instead of the setup that you had before, where you constantly upgrade your weapon and you just kind of have this main setup that you can choose from, each level actually has 1 to 3 recommended weapons to play it with. So you're a little bit more limited in how you play, but it feels like each of the stages is very much designed around each of those weapons, and it allows them to do much more interesting things with each of the levels that take advantage of the weapons that they recommend you use in that level. So it makes the level again feel way more fresh, and you don't get tired of playing with all the same weapons, but you also don't have 6 weapons to choose from, which can make it very tiresome if you want to get 100% completion. So they really strike this much better balance of how you're supposed to progress through the game and how much is required to complete the game in its entirety if you want to do that. So overall, the Octo expansion DLC, and combined with the main campaign in the game, it really does make Splatoon 2 probably the most content-rich game in the series for single player. The Octo expansion campaign is really, really interesting. Aside from the final boss, which is just way too hard. I have still not beaten it. I'm not doing it. I've wasted way too much time trying to beat that stupid freaking boss, but everything else, and by final boss, I mean like a secret final boss. Not you can beat like the main campaign, the story, without any of that incredible stress, but there's a secret final boss at the end if you beat all of the stations. And I don't recommend it. I just don't. It's really, really difficult. It's possible, but I have not been able to do it. So, yeah. But overall, with these two campaigns, Splatoon 2 is a very, very good experience for single player. These two things combined, you can probably skip the first game entirely if you want to, and it just you have this really, really strong start to your experience with Splatoon. It's really good. So I recommend it, but I don't know if I would say that you should pay full price for it still. Thankfully, because it's an older game and it's been, succeeded by Splatoon 3, you can probably find it much cheaper now. And if you can find it for like, I don't know, half the price or so, even used, then yeah, it's definitely worth it for that. And then if you have the expansion pack for Nintendo Switch Online, then you can play the DLC for no additional cost. So absolutely worth it in that case. Paying the full $60 for the game and then another $20 for the DLC, it's a little bit more iffy, but otherwise this is a very good and totally worthwhile experience if you're just interested in the single player campaign. It's a very good one. And then we have Splatoon 3. And, you know, by itself, without the DLC, because I actually haven't played the DLC for this one yet, because this is sold separately, the DLC, it's not on the expansion pack yet, so I haven't played that. But by itself, this is easily the best single-player game in the series. So the way Splatoon 3 works is that it takes a lot of inspiration from the Octo expansion DLC in Splatoon 2, and it brings a lot of those elements into the same overall design. That's what the Splatoon 1 and 2's main campaigns use. So you have this bigger hub world that's fully 3D, fully navigable with your character. You're not just choosing things from a menu. And you explore this world, you have to unlock more components of it. It's actually interesting. Also, the hub world is made a little bit more interesting because it's not just fully open to you from the beginning. You actually have to unlock certain parts of it, and it costs you some of the items that you collect throughout the campaign. So it kind of limits your progress a little bit in a more interesting way than before. You kind of can explore things at your own pace in whatever order you want. But they do still have an order technically, but you can explore each of the sections of the world with a little bit more freedom, but also a little bit more restriction in a way. I would say actually probably more restriction than freedom, but that makes things a little more interesting because you make choices about where you want to go first. And I think they feel a little bit more impactful than they do in the first two games. So I think this format is very interesting for how you explore the worlds. There are more worlds than before, and they're a lot bigger, or at least they feel that way. They're much bigger worlds with a lot of levels in them. And in terms of the levels themselves, I feel like Nintendo kind of just they took a lot of the stuff from Splatoon 2 as well. And so they created a more varied and interesting experience because, you know, in the first two games, it feels like a lot of the missions, the main campaign specifically, a lot of the missions are just focused on combat. You have to beat these enemies, get through this, and get to the end. But Splatoon 2's Octo expansion introduced a few levels that are a bit different. It's not just about combat, it's about figuring out how traversal works and how things behave. So like with that, the levels I mentioned before about pushing a bowling ball to the end of the stage, it's not really about fighting the enemies around you, it's just finding out how to push the ball to the end. And so Splatoon 3 takes, you know, that idea of doing more than combat, and it merges it into the main campaign a lot more. So there are a lot of levels. There are about more than combat. Sometimes you have levels for breaking targets, and then sometimes you have levels that are more about platforming than anything. There's these levels that are focused on this zipline item that's new. And, you know, sometimes they will have enemies, but the point of beating the enemies isn't really the combat. It's more so figuring out the exact motions that you have to do to navigate the stage. And it just so happens that it also defeats enemies along with it. So everything here feels way more varied, way more interesting, and it's not as challenging as the Octo expansion DLC, which I would say is a good thing because, you know, the DLC is obviously for people who are already big fans of the main game, and they're probably very good at it already. This is the, you know, the base campaign. You kind of want it to be more accessible to anyone buying the game. So it's not as challenging, but there's still a good bit of challenge in these stages. Like, it's not an overly easy game. It's still very fun to get through, but it's not as, I guess, as frustrating as the Octo expansion DLC can be. But it does have a lot of that same variety in the levels, and it also has the variety of how you approach the levels, in the sense that, again, you're doing the same format for the weapons that you use going into each stage, only with a little bit of a twist. So you still have an upgrade an upgrade tree where you unlock upgrades for your main hero gear. So that's the hero shot and the bombs and everything. But most of the levels will still give you 1 to 3 options for the weapons that you have to use in that stage. So sometimes you will be allowed to use your hero gear and all the upgrades that you've made to it, but other times you have to use the other recommended weapons that you don't really have any control over in the same way. So they still have that sense of progression with upgrading your gear and making things easier, but you also have a lot more variety with the weapons that you have to use in each of the levels. And it doesn't do it in that overwhelming sense that the Splatoon 2 main campaign did, where main completion, the full completion of the game require you to beat every level with like 6 or 7 weapons. Instead, at most, one level might have 3 weapons that you can beat it with, but that's it. And a lot of levels only have 1, a lot of them have 3. It kind of depends on the level, and so it kind of makes each of these levels feel very specifically designed to be played with those weapons. And so they're more tightly designed, more fun to get through because they're really made with the intention of being played with those specific weapons. And everything just meshes together way better because of that. So Splatoon 3, the campaign, is definitely the best one yet. From a gameplay perspective, there's more worlds, more levels, there are more unique levels, and the sense of progression is, I think, a lot more interesting than it was in the previous games. You unlock the upgrades, but there's a lot of weapons you don't have control over in terms of the upgrades, and it makes the whole experience feel a lot more fresh the entire way through. It's really, really interesting. I felt like it was the most engaging campaign in the series. So I definitely think Splatoon 3 is the best in that sense. But not only that, the Splatoon 3 campaign also has the highest stakes in the story. And it has new connections with previous games, if previous characters appear again in the Splatoon 3 campaign. But it also adds a lot of lore to the planet that you play on. If you saw the trailers for Splatoon 3, I don't really want to spoil anything that wasn't shown before, but the campaign in Splatoon 3 was called Return of the Mammalians, which is a species that you hadn't really heard of until this point. Like in Splatoon 1 and 2, the species doesn't really appear. So you have this new species that really just kind of looks like a Therian, so from a design perspective it doesn't seem like much. But it is a new species, and it adds context to other things in the game that I don't want to spoil. But the stakes of the story feel way more impactful than before. It's not just stopping DJ Octavio again. There's a lot more to it, so the stakes are way higher. The campaign is way more fun to play through. There's more variety, more levels. And so I think they really nailed everything with the campaign in Splatoon 3. Like, this is a game where I would say the single player component is definitely worth it. I still don't know if it's worth $60, but it's easily the best one of the bunch. And I think, if you're at least open to trying the multiplayer for a little bit, combined with the single player campaign that's better than any of the previous ones, then yeah, this game is definitely worth getting. It's very fun. There's a lot of variety. And it's easier than the Octo expansion DLC, but there's still quite a bit of challenge. There's also a secret final stage, just like the Octo expansion DLC had, I guess. But while in the Octo expansion DLC, that stage was focused entirely on combat, that is way too hard. The Splatoon 3 DLC, not DLC, sorry, the Splatoon 3 final secret stage is a lot more varied again, and it's not nearly as frustrating to get through. So they really struck the right balance between offering a lot of content but still being relatively easily accessible, but also still being decently challenging. So yes, Splatoon 3 is a very, very good campaign for single player. And then if you are thinking about getting the DLC, there is a roguelite mode, I believe is the way it works, and it seems very interesting. I know people love those kinds of games these days. They're very popular. I know some people had problems with it being a little too short. I haven't tried that, but it's just the main campaign alone is super interesting, and I highly recommend it. And I'm looking forward to whatever they do next, because the Splatoon series has evolved very quickly in these first 3 entries. And you know, this is going into the next generation of Nintendo with the Switch 2. It's the first time that it's gonna get this like major bump in graphics capabilities, because you know the Switch is better than the Wii U, when you can actually really tell looking at Splatoon 2 and 3 how much better they look than Splatoon 1. But it's still very similar, so I'm really interested to see what they do once they have that extra power, and if they keep investing in the story section of these games, because it's actually gotten pretty fun. Like it wasn't much in Splatoon 1. Splatoon 2 was still kinda but then the Octo expansion DLC changed everything, and this was way more interesting. And then Splatoon 3 took a lot of that DLC, the ideas from that DLC, and mixed it with a main campaign that's a little more engrossing, and it's probably the best experience you can get in the series as a single player, player. So it's been progressing in a very interesting way, and I'm definitely excited to see what comes next in this series. So yeah, I guess that's my main takeaway. Splatoon 1 for single player, probably not really worth it, especially if you don't own a Wii U, which no one does, so just don't worry about it. Then Splatoon 2, absolutely worth it, especially if you get the DLC. That's a big component of that. There is that if you have access to the DLC in Splatoon 2, then absolutely it's worth it for the single player experience. And then Splatoon 3, even without the DLC, I would say it's worth it, because it's a very fun campaign that really ups the stakes. It adds a lot of new concepts and brings back concepts from both the main campaigns of before, but also the Octo expansion DLC. And it makes what I would say is the best experience yet for single player in the Splatoon series. And that's not even talking about the tabletop turf battle, which is the card game. I actually haven't even touched that, so I don't know exactly how much value that adds. But I know there's something more unique there, so that's also worth checking out. But either way, the Splatoon series has definitely become something that's worth it for more than the multiplayer experience, and I would recommend, if you've been curious about it, but you're not a big multiplayer person, just give it a shot. Maybe try to find Splatoon 2 used somewhere. It's probably much cheaper now. Yeah, give it a shot, and I think you're not gonna regret that. So that's my main takeaway. So if you watched all the way through the end, thank you so much, and I'm gonna see you next week. Oh, and Happy New Year, by the way. Bye.